Hi, my name is Henry, and well, it's about time I got around to this trend. Kinda surprising I didn't do this earlier, considering most of my channel is based on sharing completely useless yet fascinating information on things I have excessive knowledge about. Speaking of things I have excessive knowledge about, Watchmen. Yes, I recently stumbled across a Watchmen Iceberg created by Reddit user Song2, and decided why not, as I consider Watchmen to be one of my favorite comic books that I've ever read, as well as one of my favorite shows that I've ever watched, and also a movie that I've seen. On the small chance that you don't know how iceberg charts work, sucks for you. Just kidding, basically all the entries go from most well-known to most obscure. And yeah, that's it. I was about to give a whole entire explanation, but that's literally everything that you need to know. I don't want to waste too much time on introductions, cause we have a lot to go through. Or at least I do. You're just kind of watching. So without further ado, let's get into it. Oh wait, before I do, I'm gonna be leaving out the first layer of the iceberg. It covers the movie, comic, and show, which if you're watching this, I trust you already know what those are. So with all that out of the way, without further ado, here is the WATCHMEN Iceberg. Before Watchmen. Before Watchmen is a 2012 comic series that, as you could probably tell from the not-so-subtle title, takes place before the events of Watchmen. The series actually traces all the way back to 1985 with the original comic, as Alan Moore once stated that if the series was well received, he and Dave Gibbons would consider doing a prequel Minutemen series. But because of reasons we'll get into later on in this iceberg, a Minutemen series was never made. But we did eventually end up getting a Watchmen prequel in the form of this, yay! The series consists of the titles Minutemen, which debuted to positive reviews, Silk Spectre, which debuted to mixed reviews, The Comedian, which received mostly negative reviews, Night Owl, this debuted to positive reviews, Ozymandias, it released to mostly positive reviews, Rorschach, debuted to mixed reviews, Dr. Manhattan, which debuted to positive reviews, and also inspired a little bit of the HBO series as well, with how it delved into John's past as a half-Jewish German immigrant who lived through the Third Reich. And finally Moloch, which released to okay reviews, and it's fine. There was also a one-shot about Dollar Bill, you know, that one guy who showed up once and then fucking died. Alan Moore has spoken about his distaste for this series in particular, calling it, quote, completely shameless. Like I said, we'll get into that later on if you aren't already familiar with Watchmen's history with creator rights. But for now, just keep that comment in the back of your noggin. Doomsday Clock. Doomsday Clock is a comic series from 2017 written by Jeff Johns with art by Gary Frank and Brad Anderson. The story also acts as one of DC's universe reboot events like Crisis on Infinite Earths, while also acting as a sequel to the original Watchmen comic, and also a crossover of sorts between the regular DC universe and the Watchmen universe. Although I can't summarize the entire comic, the basic story involves the public finding out the alien squid was fabricated. So, Ozymandias travels to the main DC universe, which is revealed to be where Dr. Manhattan fucked off to, in order to convince him to use his powers to rewrite the universe. Which is something he can do, I guess. So it's revealed Manhattan is responsible for why things are so miserable in the New 52 reboot, because he interferes with history and that leads to the Justice Society of America never forming. Alongside this storyline, something else that's notable about this comic is the introductions of 3 new characters to Watchmen. These being Mime and Marionette, who are now pretty well-known Watchmen characters because of this story, as well as a new Rorschach, this time with the character of Reggie Long taking up the mantle. Because, you know, Walter Kovacs got turned into human jelly last time we saw him. The story's reception is really mixed. It all depends on where you look, really. Some people really like it and think it's a worthy follow-up to the Watchmen comic, as well as a good reboot story for DC Rebirth. Meanwhile, other people just see this series as another example of DC misunderstanding the original Watchmen comic. I won't give my opinion, I'm just here to explain it. Also, there's a Kitty Boobastis, and I love it. Watchmen the Motion Comic. Watchmen the Motion Comic is Watchmen, but as a motion comic. Watchmen The End Is Nigh. Watchmen The End Is Nigh is a 2009 episodic beat-em-up game that was made as a tie-in for the Snyder film, and acts as a prequel to it that takes place during the Crime Busters era of the story before the Keene Act is passed. You play as everybody's favorite dog parent Rorschach, as well as Owl Guy, as they traverse through different levels to take down a crime lord known as Underboss. And yeah, that's basically it. Rorschach 2020. Rorschach is a character from Watchmen. It's also a comic book series that acts as a sequel taking place years after the events of the original comic. Yeah, we get a few of those every once in a while. But more interestingly, it also acts as a sequel/tie-in to the HBO series. The basic plot involves a detective investigating crimes committed by somebody who has taken up the Rorschach mantle several decades after Walter Kovac's death. But as per usual with Watchmen sequels, all the fun alien squid conspiracies we all know and love get uncovered. Okay, time for Layer 2. Watchmen Who Watches the Watchmen and Watchmen Taking Out the Trash. Back in the 80s, DC had a superhero role-playing game titled DC Heroes, published by Mayfair Games, and two of the many source books published were based on Watchmen. The plot involves a story set before the Keene Act in which Captain Metropolis summons a bunch of crime fighters, which, in the context of the game, are of course you, the players, to solve a series of kidnappings of retired superheroes. Meanwhile, Taking Out the Trash has a plot taking place during the eve of the 1968 Republican Convention, where the Minutemen have to prevent one of the three candidates from getting assassinated. I think. I'm not fully sure, I was only able to find this Amazon description of it. This entry also ties together with another entry on this same layer, which is the Watchmen Companion and Sourcebook. The sourcebook being stats and backgrounds for roleplay, and the companion being a collection of rare material from the comic. You can find the roleplay guides for surprisingly cheap online. You know, in case you're some kind of nerd who roleplays, get a load of this guy, yeah? Alan Moore wants nothing to do with Watchmen adaptations. So, long story short, but still long since there's a lot to go through, back in 1985 after Watchmen was written, Alan Moore was like, yo, me and my homeboy Dave kinda wanna keep the rights to these characters. This is an accurate Alan Moore impression. So, he struck up a deal with DC that stated after Watchmen went out of print that he would receive the Watchmen rights. Seemed pretty fair at first, right? Ha, no you fucking idiot. You see, what DC failed to tell Moore and Gibbons was that they had zero intention whatsoever to ever put Watchmen out of print, because they just kept reprinting the series. As Alan Moore put it himself in a 2006 interview with the New York Times, "You have managed to successfully swindle me, and I will never work for you again." He's referring to DC, not the New York Times, in case that wasn't clear. So, as you would expect, he's not exactly super jazzed about Watchmen adaptations that he didn't have a hand in helping create. Most people bring this distaste for Watchmen adaptations up when talking about the HBO show, but it applies to literally anything Watchmen related that isn't Moore's. Except for the role-playing modules. Apparently he had a hand in working on those. And this distaste for adaptations doesn't just stop with Watchmen either, as he's not a big fan of film adaptations of his work in general. He refuses to watch other adaptations of his books such as V for Vendetta, and the works that he does have the rights over he doesn't allow to be adapted into films. He's definitely very adamant on keeping his works as the way that they were originally intended to be. Another quote from him about the whole situation is, "My book is a comic book, not a movie, not a novel, a comic book." So yeah, it's definitely a heavily debated topic on if it's okay to enjoy other Watchmen content, considering the history of Watchmen and creator rights. And once more, I won't give my opinion. I'm just the funny boy inside your phone who explains it all to you. Watchmen is symmetrical. What I'm pretty sure this is referring to is the fact that Chapter 5 of Watchmen, Fearful Symmetry, does its title justice as the whole thing is completely symmetrical, with each page having a corresponding mirrored page of itself. Page 1 is symmetric to page 28, page 2 is symmetric to 27, and so on. And the middle point is the iconic 2 pages of Adrian beating up a hitman. This layout is likely because the chapter is very Rorschach-focused, and Rorschach's mask is symmetrical for some reason, who knows how that works. But not only is the panel layout a complete mirror, but even the artwork itself most of the time is supposed to be related to the panel that it's mirroring. To show a few of my favorite examples, here's the second panel from page 1, and the 8th panel from page 28. Here's the 6th panel from page 10, and the second panel from page 19. Just to show examples. Connections to Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan's work has a very strange but also important presence in Watchmen. Like, Bob Dylan is just kinda there. If you've bought one of the newer Watchmen reprints, the first thing your eyeballs are greeted with is the cover, obviously, but flipping forward a bit, we'll review an excerpt from Dave Gibbons that literally starts with, "It began with Bob Dylan." A couplet from his 1966 masterpiece Desolation Row was the spark that one day would ignite Watchmen. Blah 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 blah, the whole thing is 2 pages, I'm not reading it all, but you get the point. It's important. The first instance of Bob Dylan's work playing a role in the comic itself comes in the very first chapter, which is named "At Midnight All the Agents," a direct quote from the Desolation Row couplet that Gibbons was referring to, and chapter 10 is named "Two Riders Were Approaching," which is yet another quote, this time from All Along the Watchtower. Ozymandias is, or might be, gay. Adrian Veidt's sexuality in Watchmen is left very ambiguous, with a lot of people having different interpretations of what exactly he is. During a Rorschach monologue, he describes Veidt as possibly homosexual, and of course there's his interesting obsession with Alexander the Great. Another theory for his sexuality is that he's asexual. As Damon Lindelof once stated, despite being very physically attractive, he doesn't really show any attraction to others. Hey, as an ace person myself, I'll take that representation. If you ignore all the killing half of New York and massacring a bunch of clone stuff, I'd say he's a pretty good icon. Watchmen the Annotated Edition. Watchmen the Annotated Edition is exactly what it sounds like. A version of Watchmen that includes annotations that go very in-depth with every page. There's plenty of interesting and new things you probably never noticed to be found. Like, did you ever notice this dude flipping Rorschach off in the first page? I bet you didn't. Watchmen Noir. This is yet another alternate version of the OG Watchmen comic, this time in black and white. Okay, you're really starting to push the limits of different Watchmen comics here, DC, but I'll give you a pass because the cover looks cool. Watching the Watchmen. This is an art collection book, and like a lot of art collection books, it includes a ton of early sketches for the comic, as well as a lot of concept art, which is all really neat to look at. And it makes for a great and easy way for finding all the pieces of media from early in the comic's creation, which certainly makes my job easier when it comes to researching all this wacky stuff. Saturday Morning Watchmen. Actually, one thing I would like to mention, people constantly say that Alan Moore has seen this video before and deemed it the only adaptation that he enjoys. And as much as I would love for that to be true, I haven't found anything proving this aside from word of mouth. But don't be disillusioned yet, friends, as although Moore hasn't seen it, Dave Gibbons has, and stated before that he enjoyed it. Quote, "The thing is, obviously they're having fun with it, but the way that it was done, you know that the person really cared about what they were doing. Really knew Watchmen in detail. Hooded Justice is black. Hooded Justice is black. Yeah, it's revealed in the HBO show that Hooded Justice is the grandfather of our protagonist Angela Abar. This is a very major plotline for the series, and I won't go into recapping it all since it heavily ties into other plotlines. Interestingly enough, if you search further down the rabbit hole of early concepts for the Watchmen comic, you'll find that Hooded Justice was originally planned to be a superhero who supposedly had supernatural abilities, and his name was originally going to be Brother Knight. I'm sure you can guess how that might have influenced the HBO show when creating the character of Sister Knight. This is even briefly referenced during the episode This Extraordinary Being, which focuses entirely on this plotline. Also, this is like the only entry in this entire iceberg completely about the HBO series, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff to be found in that piece of Watchmen media. Stuff that I have way too much knowledge about. Maybe I could make my own iceberg about the show and make a sequel video. Who am I kidding? That's way too much effort. Watchmen, Kubricks, Bear Bricks, and Mezits. This is just referring to all these pieces of merchandise, which are the closest we'll ever get to Watchmen Lego products, which makes my little Watchmen and Lego loving heart sad. Also, these two fellows are apparently only exclusively sold in Japan. Yo, he looking kinda silly though. Rorschach's original design. This can be found in the aforementioned Watching the Watchmen art book, and here it is. Geez, Rorschach, I know you're kind of infamous for being a weirdo, but maybe cover up a bit? I seriously wonder how this design would have been implemented. Would he, flash people whenever he gets into a fight? Also, another alternate design that's still pretty different from what we eventually got can be seen in this early sketch. And if you're thinking, hey, he kinda looks like the Question, well, there's actually an explanation for that. Watchmen is based off of Charlton comic characters. In the 1980s, DC acquired a lot of characters from the defunct Charlton comics, and since nothing was really being done with them, Alan Moore was like, sick, free characters. And the original pitch for Watchmen would have revolved around these characters in a murder mystery type story. Eventually, though, it was decided that the story should take place outside of the mainline DC continuity to be its own thing, and so the characters were transformed into something new for the story's sake. Captain Atom became Dr. Manhattan, Blue Beetle became Night Owl, Nightshade became Silk Spectre, Peacemaker became the Comedian, Thunderbolt became Ozymandias, and of course, the Question became Rorschach. Okay, layer 4 time. Watchmen by Sam Hamm. This one is a lot. In 1987, Warner Bros. Had acquired the rights to a Watchmen film adaptation. Alan Moore was originally approached to adapt it, but for mysterious reasons nobody will ever be able to figure out, he denied their offer. So, Sam Hamm, who is most well known for his work on Batman '89, and since I don't want to take up an entire section of this video script summarizing the film myself, I'll just avoid doing my work more than I usually do. The script begins in 1976 with the terrorist situation on the Statue of Liberty. Led by Captain Metropolis and Adrian Veidt, aka Ozymandias, the Watchmen, set out to foil the plot, much to the chagrin of SWAT teams. However, Dr. Manhattan fails to save the lead terrorist from destroying Lady Liberty, causing a severe backlash on the team's reputation by the media and disgruntled public. Shortly afterwards, the Keene Act is passed by the president to outlaw all vigilante action, and the Watchmen disband as a result later on. 10 years later in 1986, Rorschach is shown, in a civilian persona of Walter Kovacs, hearing of the death of Edward Blake, also known as the Comedian, who was supposedly thrown to his death from his apartment window. It is mentioned by other characters that he is currently wanted on 14 charges of murder, 8 of which he claims to have been trumped up. He later meets up with Dan Triberg, the former Night Owl, to discuss the murder and the possible implications it means for them. After Rorschach makes a rendezvous at Veidt Industries and finds no answers, Veidt goes to Rockefeller Military Centers to speak with Dr. Manhattan, formerly Jonathan Osterman, and Laurie Giuspecci, who was once Silk Spectre, about Blake's death. During this time, Laurie's relationship with Manhattan dissolves, and she becomes romantically involved with Dan. Rumors spread of former colleagues of Manhattan contracting cancer, and Laurie is suspected of being infected herself. A checkup soon reveals she indeed has lung cancer. When Manhattan appears on television for an interview, he is confronted with these allegations, resulting in a self-imposed exile to Mars. Blah blah blah, Dr. Manhattan relives his origin, Rorschach gets arrested and then broken out, Veidt almost gets assassinated, Dr. Manhattan takes Laurie to Mars and also cures her cancer because, he's Dr. Manhattan. Basically stuff that happens in the comic. Anyways, upon arriving at Karnak, Veidt's Antarctic base of operations, the team discovers that not only is Veidt responsible for Rorschach's framing, Moloch's murder, John's exile, and Blake's death, he is planning to go back in time, using a tachyon chamber to revise the timeline of history. He reasons that John's becoming a superpowered being has caused the world to become the way it is. and it is his existence that the Cold War hinges upon. His rationale is that going back in time to 1962 and assassinating John before his incident will straighten the timeline and avoid the impending nuclear war altogether. In the end, Light is vaporized by the machine as he attempts to return to the 1960s. Having regained his humanity, Dr. Manhattan sacrifices himself by going back in time to save his former self from being disintegrated and reformed, giving John Osterman the chance for a happy life with Janie Slater. The timeline is readjusted so that America does not win the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon resigns from presidency after the Watergate scandal, nuclear war with Russia is averted, and costumed heroes are confined to the pages of comic books. However, Rorschach, Night Owl, and Silk Spectre are transported to New York City in the late 1980s, where Watchmen is a successful comic book maxi series. As they create a sensation from the local pedestrians due to their uniforms standing out of place, a group of policemen descend upon them. The script then ends with Rorschach hissing at the cops, implying that they will fight back. What's with Watchmen adaptations and leaving out the squid? They might as well just burn the comic in front of our faces at this point. This film ended up getting cancelled not too long after it was written due to budget issues and also script concerns, as Terry Gilliam was unsatisfied with the first draft, stating that it was just a bunch of superheroes. A new script was written afterwards which supposedly would have had a tone closer to that of the comic, taking elements such as Rorschach's narration and implementing cut scenes. This alternate draft, however, has never been released for whatever reason. I doubt they're going to be doing anything with it anytime soon. Watchmen by David Hayter and Alex C. This is yet another cancelled film adaptation. There isn't a summary of the script on the wiki, unfortunately for me, but there's plenty of examples of differences from the book. Instead of the 1985 setting used in the comics, the script takes place in 2004, whereas the comedian had fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Hayter has it stated that Blake fought in the last days of the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and Iraq. The United States conflict with Russia is changed to one with Afghanistan, with all references to the communists replaced with Middle Eastern terrorists. Laurie Gispecci is called Silk Spectre in the comics, but in this version has her codename as being Slingshot. This is explained by having Dr. Manhattan given her the power to sling balls of energy as a birthday present. Cool. Instead of a giant squid, Adrian Veidt triggers a series of nuclear explosions around the world. Wasn't that exactly what he was trying to prevent from happening? The project was pretty much set up for production up until one of the directors, Paul Greengrass, just kind of vanished from the project, and eventually it was decided by Hayter to just drop the whole thing altogether. But the story does have a somewhat happy ending, as Hayter and C ended up having a huge input on the actually made Watchmen film. But easily the most interesting part of all of this is the fact that there's a piece of test footage based on the scene where Rorschach informs Dan about the comedian becoming significantly less alive than usual. And yes, don't worry, they did include Rorschach eating beans.
Back when we were partners.
Yeah, those were great times, Rorschach. Great times. Whatever happened to them?
You quit.
Mad Magazine's Watchmen. This is a Watchmen parody comic by Mad Magazine that started getting published around 2009, the year that the Watchmen film released. It's also the year that the swine flu pandemic happened, but we're here to talk about Watchmen, so forget I mentioned that. Like most Watchmen parodies, it includes a bit of commentary and criticism about adapting and commercializing Watchmen while also still having the classic juvenile Matt sense of humor. It's pretty entertaining. Something interesting to note is that Dave Gibbons and John Higgins actually contributed their art to a variant cover of the issue for the New York Comic Con Special Edition, Watchmen Babies and V for Vacation. This is referring to a pretty well-known Simpsons joke which, surprise, making fun of Watchmen commercialization again. What's crazy about this is that they actually got Alan Moore to voice himself for this episode, which is pretty cool, and also probably the most involved he'll ever be again with Watchmen. Neil Gaiman's Watch Dogs. This refers to a sketch that Neil Gaiman, yes, writer of Coraline and Sandman Neil Gaiman, did as a suggestion for a possible spin-off of Watchmen for Alan Moore. This is cute. I like this. Also, fun fact, he drew this before he'd ever even written a comic book before. Also, funner fact, this sketch is included at the very end of most Watchmen copies. Also, Neil Gaiman's name lined up 3 whole times in my script. Wow, would you look at that? Or whatever you want, Dave. This is something that Alan Moore would write in his panel descriptions to Dave Gibbons in reference to what the art should look like. Or at least that's what I think it is. The Watchmen scripts are lost media, so that makes my job less easy. Hooded Justice Death Theory. In 1999, some fella named James Gifford, published a paper, whatever that means, which presented a theory that Hooded Justice and Captain Metropolis never died, and were still very much alive and not deceased in 1985. And not only that, but he suggests that we actually see the pair in the very first chapter. The theory also states that they faked their supposed deaths so that they could retire from hero work, which is a bit of an excessive way to quit your day job. Dave Gibbons actually acknowledged this theory, stating, "That wasn't our intention, but it's such an interesting and plausible theory that I'm reluctant to deny it." Of course, the HBO show sorta disproves that theory by diving into Hooded Justice's backstory, but honestly at this point, the canonicity of anything outside the original comic is entirely up to you. Mo Vernon is the comedian's real father theory. This is a fan theory, which I think came from Reddit, that suggests that Mo Vernon, whom we see briefly in one of the Under the Hood excerpts, is actually the comedian's dad. The evidence for this is the similarities in their features and personality, and how the name Mo can also be short for Morgan, which as we see from his gravestone is the comedian's second name. Mo is also described as having loved gag gifts, which is more in line with the comedian name compared to Blake's cynical outlook on everything. The theory states that when Mo found out that his wife had cheated, he took his own life, which leaves Edward Blake fatherless and births his cynical outlook on life, as well as his hatred and abusive attitude towards women. There's a couple of other things in the theory, but for the sake of time, we'll just leave it at that. Okay, next layer time. Watchmen the mobile game. Now this one is pretty interesting. Or maybe that's just my strange passion for really obscure media speaking. Watchmen the mobile game was a mobile game developed by Glue Mobile that acts as a sort of Street Fighter-like beat-em-up, I think, probably. It allows you to either play as Night Owl, superheroing in the streets of pre-Keenack, New York, beating up thugs, or play as the comedian, killing people in Vietnam, which might be insensitive. It came out in 2008, which of course makes it a tie-in for the Snyder movie, and it's pretty interesting searching on the web for this game since most of what pops up is either Google thinking you're talking about the other Snyder tie-in beat-em-up game, or websites actually from 2008, including this movie website, which is pretty interesting to go through. Watchmen in the DCEU. This is a theory that suggests that Zack Snyder's Watchmen actually fits into the DC cinematic universe. This Reddit post I found summarizes it pretty well, and it's pretty short, so I'll just read it. In the Watchmen film, Nixon was elected president in 1968 and was repeatedly re-elected and was still president in 1985. After the destruction of New York in 1985, he was able to end the Cold War because he and the Soviet Union allied against Dr. Manhattan. In Watchmen, anti-vigilante sentiment leads to masked crime fighters being outlawed. That's why after 20 years, Batman is thought of more as a myth, since so few criminals have seen him. Superheroes/metahumans in the DCEU have to be more discreet or they could be arrested. We see how many villains are in jail in Suicide Squad, but Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Aquaman, and Cyborg are all trying to stay under the radar. After Superman reveals himself in Man of Steel, he saves the world from Zod, but the level of destruction in Metropolis brings back bad memories of Dr. Manhattan destroying New York. Some people support the return of superheroes, while anti-vigilante sentiment is reignited. Ironically, even by some superheroes. Batman vs. Superman. Watchmen and all the films in the DCEU are directed or produced by Zack Snyder. You can tell this was written a while ago, so similarities between the films would be likely. However, there are certain Easter eggs that make it seem like they could be in the same universe. So, if you're not quite convinced yet, here's a few instances of Watchmen imagery being referenced in the DCEU films. Like here's the end is nigh being graffitied, or the bloody smiley face being graffitied, or who watches the Watchmen being graffitied. Yeah, there's a lot of variety here. Another possible explanation is that the Watchmen characters exist in this universe, but the events of Watchmen didn't happen. Or at least happen in a different way that didn't result in such big events like Manhattan winning Vietnam, or a giant squid killing half of New York. Oh wait, no, we're talking about Snyder Watchmen here. He did something different. It was like a big blue ball or something. I don't. Watchmen Justice is Coming. Boy, if I had $1 for every time I've had to explain a Watchmen fighting game that's supposed to be a tie-in for the movie, I'd have $3. Which isn't a lot of money, but isn't it strange I've had to do it 3 times? But what separates this game from the previous two is that this one is actually an MMO. Once more developed by Glue Mobile, it was released exclusively for iPhones to coincide with the film, but it's no longer available for App Store download. In spite of this, it still maintains its status as the first ever online role-playing game released for the iPhone, which is an accomplishment I'm sure somebody cares about. The game takes place in 1975 New York, where citizens have decided to take up the role of superheroes after the Keene Act. You play as your own unique citizen doing stuff, and interacting with other players along the way. As mentioned before, the game is completely gone, and gameplay footage is limited. Although there's plenty of images. Like Watchmen the mobile game, I think it's interesting seeing this obscure stuff of an almost completely deceased game. Night Owl 1 saved Bruce Wayne's parents and prevented the existence of Batman. During the opening credits for the Watchmen film, we get this shot of the first Night Owl punching a burglar, meanwhile a couple stands in the back. And at first you might just say, well hey, that could be any rich couple dumb enough to walk through a dark alleyway in the middle of the night in a crime-infested town. Until you look in the background and notice the Batman posters covering the wall, as well as the thing in the back reading Gotham Opera House. Then it becomes undeniable what Zack was trying to convey with the shot. Hey guys, could you imagine a crossover story between Watchmen and the outer DC universe? That sure would be cool, right? Too bad no such thing exists. Shitty Watchmen. Shitty Watchmen gives me a ton of work where I have to censor swear words. This is a Watchmen parody of sorts by Dave Baker. Its entire gag is that it's a retelling of Watchmen that tries to simplify the text and illustrations as much as possible, while still getting the story somewhat across. And it brings us absolutely amazing pages such as... True. Clean? Drugs. Huh? Illegal. I have cancer. Cancer. Bye. Yeah, this is one of the funner Watchmen parodies. There's also a shitty The Dark Knight too, if this jostled your funny bone. Watchmensch. Probably the most interesting of the Watchmen parody comics, and also the last Watchmen parody we will be discussing, Watchmensch was a one-shot comic written by Rich Johnston with art by Simon Rochmuller. Once more, its main focus is commentary on creator rights. But unlike a lot of the Watchmen parodies on this list that tend to weave the serious commentary in with a bit of lighthearted humor, while still getting the overall point across, Watchmen really just dives straight into the harshness of the reality of how the comic industry tends to step all over creators. The story revolves around a team of lawyers, who after one of the members named Krastovsky, a weird mix of the comedian and also Krusty the Clown, is murdered, band together to solve a conspiracy within the comic industry. The team is comprised of Night Nurse, Spotty Man, who's a version of Rorschach that pretends to be Jewish, 17,000's Broadway Manhattan, a musical version of Dr. Manhattan, and Ozzy Osbourne, Ozymandias but with the speech patterns and overall design of... yeah, you can guess the rest of his shtick. It's a surprisingly layered comic, easily the most layered Watchmen parody. In the words of comic writer and editor Valerie D'Orazio, the reader can momentarily forget that he or she is reading a parody. Or at least, until Dan Dreiberg shows up in a female nurse's outfit. And they say that comics don't have relatable characters. Rorschach is V-theory. One of the most interesting theories, it goes as follows. Dr. Manhattan didn't actually kill Rorschach, as we're led to believe, but he simply made it look like he killed Rorschach as a front for what he actually did, which was send him to another universe. While trapped in this new dystopian universe, his strong sense of justice lands him in a concentration camp as a political prisoner, where he's given experimental injections that normally would kill anyone, But surprise, since he's from another universe, instead he ends up becoming stronger and sharper, but at the expense of his memories, as he completely forgets his past life as Rorschach. But despite not knowing who he is, his sense of justice and his enjoyment of hiding his face behind a mask still manages to persevere. Eventually, he escapes the camp and becomes none other than V. As stated before, both of the characters have strong senses of justice. But on top of that, they're both described as extraordinarily ugly, and they both have a sorta obsession with their alter egos and masks. And of course there's the obvious connection of them both being Alan Moore characters. WATCHMEX. This entry gave me a headache to research, but I think that I've uncovered whatever the fuck this is. I think. Basically, WATCHMEX, or Watchmen Extreme, is a non-existent 90s comic created by image boards as a sort of form of satire to mock common critiques of comics in the 90s. You know, things such as Liefeld-esque art, marketing everything as extreme, unnecessary and overdone character designs, clone sagas, robots, all that jazz. And the entire gag behind this is that things like fake covers or characters are made, usually edited from actual existing 90s comics, and people in threads talk about the series as if it actually existed, discussing such favorites as Metal Rorschach. I haven't even gotten around to talking about Boobas Tits. The jokes stretch so far to the point where an entire wiki about the completely non-existent story of WATCHMEX was made, that treats all of it as if it were an actual existing comic, and it can get interesting at times. The entire existence of this wiki, as you could imagine, has led to a bit of confusion as to whether or not this comic actually exists for people who are not into the joke, aka me. But if you look through it for long enough, it becomes more obvious the more outrageous everything becomes. Or should I say the more extreme everything becomes? Ha! Also, Communist Dr. Manhattan. Bob Dylan's favorite film is Watchmen, and Bob Dylan doesn't know Watchmen exists. Heinz 58. In the very first chapter, At Midnight All the Agents, we're given a very strange example of the little ways that Watchmen's alternate history deviates from ours. On page 18, looking closely at the can of Heinz baked beans, you can see the number 58 labeled on it. So what significance does this have, if any? Well, if you look at Heinz products in real life, the number written is actually 57, the number referring to the 57 different flavors Heinz has. So what's up here? What's the deal? Why is it 58? Well, we know that genetic experiments are a regular part of the Watchmen world, and that's what leads to things like four-legged chickens being on restaurant menus. So could this new Heinz flavor be an outcome of something similar? Was this unnoticeable detail simply an accident from Gibbons misremembering what Heinz products look like, or was this detail purposefully suggested by Moore and Gibbons as a way of showing how not all historical differences have to be huge things like America winning the Vietnam War, or the existence of masked crime fighters, but can take the form of even small things, like the amount of flavors Heinz has? Also, before some smartass comments it, yes, I'm aware that Heinz doesn't actually have 57 different varieties, but the theory doesn't exactly work with that knowledge in mind, now does it? It might sound outrageous, but honestly I wouldn't put it past them, as there's a lot of trinkets and treasures and stuff like this hidden in the art of Watchmen. And we'll immediately follow that up with the Smurfs theory. Alright, so in Doomsday Clock we are given the explanation that the rebirth version of the DC universe was created by Dr. Manhattan, and it's like implied that this all happens immediately after him peacing out during his talk with Adrian, right? But what if... Okay, hang on, just stick with me on this, okay? So Manhattan in the OG comic is very powerful. We see just how powerful he is in action. But even with how OP he is, it's still a pretty big leap from making a sandcastle on Mars to creating an entire universe. So, one can only assume that maybe he had a little bit of practice in creating a world before rebirthing the DC universe. In come Smurfs. Okay, just look, alright? It could have totally happened. In preparation for reworking an entire universe, he made a very simple universe, with simple humanoid beings who all have a specific defining trait to them, and are also blue because, Dr. Manhattan's whole thing. And he also created Gargamel as a threat to them, so he could further study them and see how they work. And before you say that this is a ridiculous fan theory, this is basically the same thing as what he does on Europa in the HBO series. Just instead of little blue people, it's not that. So, this is a completely plausible, possible scenario, and it makes sense. You're welcome. Also, I lied about this being the final layer. The actual final layer is beans. It always has been beans, and it always will be beans. What more could you possibly want? Well, we've done it. We fully covered the WATCHMEN Iceberg chart. I don't know how to end this video because I've never made an iceberg chart analysis video before. If you did enjoy this video, you can express that by supporting my passion by liking and subscribing. And if you didn't, sorry. I don't know, just toss it into the pile of Watchmen related things people don't like, there's plenty. Anyways, as always, my name is Henry, and I'll see you in the next video, which will be like in a year, cause it took me 7 months to finish this one.